She's a member of Autism Speaks University and very active member of that group. She's doing an independent study on autism, and she has plans for Light Up for Autism Day, which, as you remember, last year we did light up the Peter B. Lewis building, and she has some thoughts about some things that she'd like to do. So, Maria?
Hi. I'm going to pass out a flyer, but we're going to be lighting up Peter B. Lewis building blue, again, like we did last year. I don't know if any of you saw it, but there's a picture on the bottom here, on April 2nd, and from 6 to 8 p.m., we're going to be hosting sort of a meet and greet session. I hope that all of you are able to come, and then people from the community, local schools, bring your family, and then we'll have some students from Case Western as well. So it'll be an opportunity for everyone to kind of speak with each other, but then meet other people from the community surrounded around autism. And then also hopefully have a speaker from the Autism Center, a speaker from our Autism Speaks U chapter, and we're looking into seeing if there's a person with autism who may want to speak at the event as well. So if you have any recommendations for that, feel free to contact me and I'll pass this out. It's a free event and parking should be available all along the streets, but also we're looking into getting some of the lots to have access. So.
So if you hear from Maria, she's contacting a good many of you and visiting centers and talking to faculty and others who are doing research. So please know who she is and interact with her. Now, I am really pleased to introduce to you today Dr. Nancy Minshew, who is director of the Autism Center of Excellence at the University of Pittsburgh. Dr. Minshew received her BA in chemistry from Mills College and began a long series of awards and accomplishments then with an award as the Outstanding Freshman in Chemistry, and graduated Phi Beta Kappa. She received her medical degree from Washington University of St. Louis and subsequently did internships in pediatrics and pediatric neurology and is board certified in neurology and psychiatry with special competence in child neurology. Dr. Minshew's career moved from the University of Texas in Dallas to the University of Pittsburgh School of Medicine, where she has really made seminal and enduring contributions to research and practice in autism spectrum disorders that continue to flourish and inform the field. She's author of over 152 peer-reviewed articles and 47 chapters. Her most recent article is a collaboration with our own Dr. Tom Frazier. Raise your hand, Tom. A longitudinal MRI study of the corpus callosum in autism. Her pioneering work appears to have begun with paper number 14, from what I can tell from this ridiculously huge CV that I've been carrying around for 2 days, titled The Clinical Spectrum of Autism, which she wrote in 1988. Since then, she's identified understanding the neurobiology of autism and the information processing mechanisms underlying autism as major foci of her work, especially deciphering altered brain connectivity. Dr. Minshew, as I said, has received numerous honors throughout her career, and she's rightly recognized as one of the major seminal catalyzing scientists and clinicians working in the field of autism. Her other honors related to autism include such things as the Autism Societies of America's Champion Award and the Philadelphia Chapter's Hero Award, as well as the Distinguished Daughter of Pennsylvania. And being a Pennsylvanian, it makes me very proud. I also want to say that she is just a terrific person to be with. I've heard of Dr. Nancy Minshew for as long as I've been in psychology, and never met her, so met her yesterday, went over to meet her at Sergio's for lunch, and we had a wonderful lunch, and then I didn't have my credit card. So she was just great. She just jumped up and paid for the lunch, which we will, I promised her we would reimburse her for. But we're extremely lucky to have Nancy Minshew here today, so please welcome me with a great Cleveland welcome.
You'll probably never forget that lunch. It was a wonderful lunch. Okay, today I have the challenge of trying to communicate effectively to a rather diverse audience from people who have developed schools for autism up to perhaps developmental neurobiologists and everything in between, and to talk about perhaps how our center evolved over the space of 25 years, a really impossible job. So I've tried to pick a few areas that represent concepts and also highlight how a neurologist's perspective about brain and behavior has been helpful, certainly to our program. Now, all of the work that I talked about was accomplished in collaboration with many other people, and so please don't think that I did all of this by my little self or even led all of it. You know, the imagers and the geneticists, they all are just wonderful people. I've been very fortunate to be in Pittsburgh, where we have the scientists at the University of Pittsburgh, but also at Carnegie Mellon University, and it's a rich interaction across departments and universities. Now, first of all, everything that we can say about autism, all the progress that we've made comes down to resulting from participation by families who have one or more individuals with autism, and families who don't have individuals with autism, who are our comparison group. And it is really an enormous amount of work for these people to participate. So a great deal of society benefits from the participation of a small group. And they often come back again and again and again. Now, I have just briefly a generic mission statement probably fits most autism centers. And the first goal of an autism research-oriented center is to increase the understanding of the causes of autism or the mechanisms underlying the disorder that we see clinically, because that's the key to true advances in intervention and services. The second thing is, for a center to work or function effectively, we have to have many different disciplines represented, and they have to work collaboratively and closely together. And the thing that I've appreciated over the last couple of decades is that every discipline has its own culture, its own words or terminology. So if you have 3 disciplines in the room, you're going to have 3 different definitions of the word cognitive. So we have to understand that we may be talking about the same thing and just use different words. Or we may, whatever. So that's something that has to be dealt with and is not dealt with very well. Autism is so complex, and it goes all the way from early recognition or recognition across a lifespan and the basic getting through each day for family to the developmental neurobiologist and the geneticist, or even the stem cell person who's never seen a person with autism and really doesn't understand the disorder. And I find it's sort of like a cloud. And the people over here who are on the front lines don't necessarily even understand why this is a neurodevelopmental disorder. What is a neurodevelopmental disorder? And then the geneticists and developmental neurologists walk into the scene some 15, 20 years into it and say, well, it's obviously a disorder of neuronal organization events and maybe other things, migration, which is a shock because most people don't think in those terms, but that's just part of the issues. If we're going to make the difference that a center is supposed to make in the lives of people, we all have to work together. And we've made a lot of progress in autism research, and it's accelerating pace, especially in the last 5 to 10 years, and yet families haven't experienced the benefits of that. And so there's a lot of pent-up accomplishments that are restricted to research centers and not a way to get those into interventions and services. So that's a great obstacle that everybody is going to have to deal with, including organizations like NIH. Now, we'll start with the cause of autism because that's indeed where most research starts. And the problem is that the word cause means different things to different people. Neurologists distinguish between etiology, what is the real triggering event? Could it be fetal rubella, or could it be tuberous sclerosis, or any of a variety. That's specific etiology. Versus the pathophysiology, which is what does that etiology trigger in the brain exactly, and how does that end up connected to the manifestations that you see? So it's really pathophysiology, and if there wasn't a shared pathophysiology across the many different cases of autism, we couldn't have done any of the research. So we've gone along with the assumption that the clinical syndrome does arise from some common pathophysiology, even if the specific etiology differs. But other times people say, well, my child just did such and so in the grocery store. What caused him to do that? So to them, cause is really about their child in that circumstance and what caused that. And we usually deal with that with the functional analysis of behavior. But overall, what we see in the field of autism research is a real disconnection between behavior and the brain. So some people really focus on behavior and some people really focus on the brain, and the two obviously go together. What's really interesting now, I think, is that we know that surely brain circuitry and what's going on in the brain produces a lot of the abilities that we have. But what we also are beginning to realize is that thinking can change the brain. And obviously experience does, but actually thinking. And so what I'm leading up to, of course, is that cognitive interventions can change the brain across the lifespan. So that's a different way of looking at that. Now here's the very typical sequence of events, and it doesn't have other things like environment or other things that impact, but these are the basic structure of what we're looking to define in autism, and we've made a fair amount of progress, but the brain is so incredibly complex that the more we learn, the more we realize we don't yet know, but it is knowable. It just will take a lot of people over time. Now let's step aside for just a minute and look at what we have, the problem that we have to deal with, in essence, is what is autistic disorder. I didn't put Asperger's up here, or NOS, which are all going to meld into ASD. But look at the criteria that we have in DSM. We have, I don't know if this, oh, it does work. How wonderful. It's always been called a disorder with 3 core symptoms. You know, the social impairment, the communication, and this restricted and repetitive behavior. That's the 3 core symptoms of autism, the most prominent. But then the criteria also say, well, there's also some associated symptoms, and then they have the other things, the so-called comorbid conditions, intellectual disability, attention deficit disorder, hyperactivity, seizures, mood problems, la. You'll see a long list. And for a neurologist, it's like, well, what do you do with this? We have 3 core deficits, but what does it mean to be an associated symptom? Where did that come from? You know? And then comorbid. The first one, that's obviously not a second condition that happened to go along with autism, is this what they call the mental retardation or intellectual disability. Because if you remember your rules of genetics, how often 2 things co-occur is the prevalence of one times the prevalence of other, right? We have a problem in that autism is, if you want to call it uncommon now, then you have intellectual disability is uncommon too. So how does that chance co-occurrence explain 50% of children with autism having intellectual disability? It can't be, oh my, we had 2 lightning strikes, and so they went together. The same thing with motor and sensory and other deficits, but that's an example of how we had this dissociation between behavior and the brain. Now, here, some of you be aware of Michael Rudder, who's Sir Michael Rudder now, real prominent a psychiatrist who's really influenced many areas in psychiatry, but autism being one of them. And I've really always admired his research because he would state the question that he wanted to address in his study, the methods that he used, and when he got to the end, he said, this is what we know, and this is all we know. If we want to know this more, we have to design another study. And if anything, in research, what happens now is we have these really interesting stories, nice little stories about how the finding that you just got explains everything in the whole world, you know? And we've gotten to the point where people aren't distinguishing between what is really supported by the evidence versus what is speculation. And the problem is really compounded because it gets into the media and it has its own life. And then pretty soon families who have no idea that one is evidence-based and the other is just pure speculation are running with the whole thing. So that's a real big problem. But he, among other things, this was one of the questions that Sir Michael asked in 2007. Why do all these manifestations go together? Did we just create this artificially with our diagnostic criteria? Or is there something that, some underlying feature that causes all of these to go together? So that is, of course, where we started in autism 25 years ago is what is the pattern or profile of impairments and intact abilities, traditional solid neurology. Now, neurologists start there, whether they're in the emergency room or doing research, because they know that that profile or constellation conforms to the underlying mechanism. So that's why we want to know that. It also tells us where it is in the brain. Mode of onset also tells us a lot about the actual what is it. Now, at the same time, we are looking at, starting with the profile, the rest of the field is looking for a single primary deficit that causes all of autism. And those who are around a long time remember, and it was everything from sensory, what they called sensory inconstancy, like the radio that's sometimes on and off, problems with attention, believe it or not, amnesia, medial temporal dysfunction, and then we got into the shifting attention. There was this problem with the cerebellum, that it couldn't shift attention, and then there was this nice little story about how that caused all of autism, and in the New York Times there's a picture of the brain with a little child sitting with a seat in the cerebellum, like that was the cause of autism. And the problem with that, fundamentally, of course, was the problem with shifting was not in the cerebellum, it was in the frontal lobes. And it wasn't exactly attention, it's more like executive abilities. So that, you know, that's one story that just, but the problem with that, again, is that that gets out to the community really fast. And interventions were developed in the community to train kids to shift attention. Okay, so everything kind of goes far, far further than it should, and we were not critical enough about that. But in neurology, we know there's never going to be a single primary deficit causing anything. You can't damage the brain that way, or whether it's developmental or acquired damage. And the other thing that neurologists know that some other people don't know is that there can be an abnormality in the brain present from birth, but you don't know it's there until the time and development comes for that skill to be expressed. So the child born with dyslexia, so to speak, you don't know he's dyslexic until what? He gets to school age and goes to read, although they also have early manifestations that are not recognized as being connected. They have the converse profile from the one I'm going to show you with autism. So that's a problem. So if you have a disorder that's defined by 3 core deficits with social communication and problem solving, those are pretty high order skills. Do you expect you're going to see that in the first year of life? But believe it or not, the social motivation theory proposed that if you saw these kids early enough, what you'd see as the first manifestation was the social impairment. Okay, first in time became their motto. And they're still trying, but we'll talk about why that's not going to pan out. So the other thing that construct that child neurologists work with in terms of neurodevelopmental disorder these are the major events, categories of events in brain development. And if you go, for example, to Joe Volpe's textbook about neonatal neurology, the first couple of chapters talk about, well, if we have a disturbance in organogenesis, what do we see as a clinical syndrome? And all the way down. So by the time I'd even started autism, I'd read that, of course, and I remembered the part that Joe Volpe wrote about how neuronal organization are the events that produce the circuitry that underlie the abilities that are most uniquely human. And those people with experience with autism knows that's exactly what's impacted by autism. Social, language, communication, and then of course not to mention some other things, skilled motor movements, higher cortical sensory. But we'll come to that. So I was already primed, and in the time since, we clearly have documented neuronal organization events are impacted. There's some genes that have identified neuronal migration impairments. And then, of course, we have the, I'm not sure if it's neuronal proliferation, but about 8 to 10% of extreme preemies or micropreemies who survive will develop autism. And it's the same autism that we see, except it has cerebral palsy. So what's happened is they've had a periventricular infarct that's caught the neurons that are migrating. Remember, the neurons multiply next to the ventricles in the center of the brain, and then they begin their path outwards. And at that 28 weeks, this is why it's extreme preemies and not all, that's where the neurons are. They're right in that periventricular zone. If they get a hypoxic ischemic event, it disturbs that. So, you know, the first guess is maybe there's not enough neurons, but the other thing is if they get stalled there because they're kind of sick, or the tissue is such they can't get through the edema or I don't know what, and they do get to their proper destination, it's too late. They've missed the train to make the connections. So who knows what it is, but this is something that you could look at with some animal models, primates maybe, and kind of figure that out. But at any rate, so we have already implicated those events. I think I'll put this in there, but if a neurologist, a child neurologist, looks at autism as a syndrome, in the space of a few minutes, they could tell you what part of the brain is affected. Unfortunately, that never happened. But I remember being asked to substitute at the last minute for somebody to give a noon lecture for the residents. And I was talking on the phone to somebody else, and so I just outlined this. It's the old Foursquare. Is it gray matter, white matter? Is it cortical? Is it subcortical? And that essentially put me into, this is association cortex. In other words, autism is really a disorder defined by problems or with complex behavior, types of behavior, cognition, language, general intellectual disability, and in 20-30% seizures. So to a neurologist, the most common place for that is association cortex. Within the other things that you notice is they're not blind and deaf. I understand fetal rubella, but the vast majority of kids with autism don't have any primary sensory deficit. They don't have long tract signs. They don't have cerebral palsy, for example. But the other big one was after a couple of years of seeing these 3 to 5-year-olds with autism, they learned how to read, and they loved to say words like asparagus and telephone, and they'd say those words and they'd laugh. And their visual spatial abilities, for most of them, seemed to be not only good, but great. I remember the mother comes in, my son can put together a puzzle if you put it face down on the floor. In other words, they did it from the shapes. And invariably, if they drew a map of the United States, they started from the inside. The rest of us can't do that. We need to create that structure of the whole thing and then kind of work in. But they start in the middle and go out. And when they got all the states in, they put the capitals in, then they put the superhighways or the rivers or some other detail that none of us will ever get, you know. So I learned it could not be focal or localized association cortex. It had to be distributed in the connections in cortical systems. So what's your differential diagnosis of a de novo developing neurodevelopmental disorder like this? Meaning it's not asphyxia and it's not a car accident, not meningitis. It's those areas that I told you about. Association cortex, distributed neural network, and of course, neuronal organization was a given. So that's where you can go with the neurologic framework. And then of course we know brain development is under tight genetic control. And we know it's incredibly complex. So there had to be genes that were involved. Now, many people, we've gone so far in the last 10 years, and we couldn't have gone so far if we hadn't gone slowly in the previous years to resolve a lot of issues. But I think people are getting surprised by the complexity of the answer. And, you know, we started out with a genetic model of 2 to 4, maybe 10, maybe 20 genes. And the genetic consortiums in autism will be announcing an additional hundreds of genes this May. And they've got so many genes and the protein-protein interaction pictures are just, you know, looks like a Jackson Pollock picture, you know. They don't know what's proximal, what's secondary or distal, which gene should they go after. So it's so complex, and it reminds me of about 10 years ago. You know, when I started, there was no MRI, so that meant you're not going to do imaging research in autism because you've got radiation. And if we're doing research, we want to often do repeated measures, but you're not going to do that in a child. You're not going to do it once in a child. So we had to wait for MRI, and of course, what we were waiting for is fMRI, so we could have something for localization. And finally, of course, that developed, and now miracles, it's not a miracle, it's math. The miracle of math has brought us the advance with diffusion tensor imaging, which is just rapidly improving. Every 3 or 4 months, they'll change their protocol so that we can begin to see what's going on in the brain. But when we started, we didn't have that, okay? So you had to approach this problem the way that you could. And the way that we did is we just did a study of the neuropsychological profile in autism compared to age, IQ, and gender-matched controls. And we took all of the major domains. These are the ones that have deficits. They got in backwards. Let's start with this one. These are the domains without deficits. What there were when we started was 5 to 10 really entrenched theories. And I mean, people had a hold of those like they were super glue. And they were not letting go of those. But if you looked at them, they had very little data to support them. There was 1 or 2 little things, and it became a whole theory. And the theories really got in the way of making progress. I think we're finally at a point where that's not so true. We got similarly hung up on, if you know it, central coherence theory. Be all, end all, you know, and it kept people from being able to move on, but whatever. So we had, before we could get people to think about association cortex, we had to deal with and higher order information processing. We had to get them to give up their pets. And that meant we needed evidence. So our initial approach, we looked at a wide range of abilities in each domain because there was a theory for each of these domains, okay? So we had to show them it wasn't there. So although certainly kids with autism have a syndrome that looks like ADHD, if you look at it closer, it's actually probably autism. But 60 to 70% of children who are later diagnosed with autism get a diagnosis of ADHD. That's a serious problem, because you have to say, but what about the social and what about the communication? Did we just ignore those? But that's a result of pediatricians not having much of any education about normal child development. And that's an issue that we have to deal with now. They're not going to recognize autism earlier if they don't know what's really normal socially. And it can't be this crude measure of that they have. So we didn't arm them with the skills to do this. So at any rate, we tested various aspects of attention, a lot of aspects of attention. So it's not that a child with autism can't have whatever this ADHD diagnosis is that they get. It's just they're not going to be in this study. Because if you want to do this, all of these, we had a 2-day test paradigm to start with. So in order to sit at the table, do the testing in a reasonable period of time, you couldn't have ADHD, right? But it also means that all the kids we saw had documented ADI, that's the instruments that became the gold standard that were developed in the late 80s. We didn't have those before, so we had to have that. And because people still didn't recognize verbal people as having autism, we sent all the tapes to Kathy Lord, who developed the instruments. Kathy Lord and Sir Michael developed these instruments because there's such a credibility issue. If you want to know why prevalence doubled, we added the top half of the spectrum back. It was always there. When people say, oh, that's not Canner autism, it most certainly is. You go back and read his papers. He had the entire spectrum documented then, and the culture of psychiatry just lopped it off. And now we've gotten it back. But anyway, see, I'm great for digressions, because after you do things for so long, you may have started here, but boy, you end up over there. And I can't help myself, except that I only have 45 minutes. So we looked at all of these areas. As a neurologist, we're aware that there's elementary sensory perception, and it's represented in about up to here, but there's higher cortical sensory perception. In other words, this whole thing under your hat does a lot with the sensory information that you get. So that if you have your eyes closed and you're reaching in your bag and you pick up a paper clip, you can identify what it is without, right? You don't have to look at it, you know what it is. Or the most challenging test that we used for these in this area was fingertip number writing. It requires the most integration of information. And about 60% of the people with autism that we tested had moderate deficits in that area. But as a neurologist, if this is going to be a cortical problem, we're going to have higher cortical sensory deficits. We also have to have problems with motor praxis, or skilled motor movements. And that was at a time that people didn't even think about that kind of motor problem. And we had our simple memory because of the amnesia theory, mistake, visual spatial. There's such a long history of how talented these kids are with visual spatial that we didn't put much in that domain. We had so much else to do. And the clue is that they were just not really any better than the match controls, which defies the myths that circulate. But the challenging test for neuropsychologists of visual processing is face recognition. And we all know that many of the people with autism, but not all, can have very poor face recognition. Temple Grandin is face blind. So when I see her, I say, hi, Temple, it's Nancy Minshew. Because if we're at a meeting and it could be Jerry Dawson, there was a time when Jerry and I had the same color hair, the same rimless glasses, we're the same size. Temple would talk to either one of us and think she was talking to the other. And then, of course, there's some family members who have that problem with face recognition, and they would do the same. They think we were the same. So, at any rate, we left that out of this. So it just goes to show in research, assume nothing that you can't personally document. Not that We didn't come back and pick it up, and everybody else did. So, oops, I have to go back this one. So where were our deficits? Skilled motor movement. Come on, little pointer. Skilled motor movements. Complex language. And that means on the previous slide you saw that they were not only as good as age, IQ, gender matched controls, they were better when it came to what neurologists call formal language, which means the mechanics, the vocabulary, the fluency, the spelling, the ability to read a word and say the word. They were better than their age and IQ matches. But the problem is you come to this part of it and they're worse. When you get into comprehension, they're worse. So what happens then in the public is that when a child with autism who can speaks, your brain automatically tells you, well, if a child can say thus and so, then I can talk to him at this little bit higher level. You don't know you're doing that, but your brain just automatically knows when a child talks and whatever age they are, you talk to them in an appropriate way. And you don't really have to think about it. So their enhanced abilities in elementary language means your brain, everybody's brain is miscued to think that they understand even more than that. And the problem is they understand even less. So you get this big gap. If I had a nickel for every time somebody said, I don't know why he doesn't understand the instructions. He says the instructions while he's doing what he's not supposed to do. And, it's like, don't get it in the refrigerator between meals. What does that mean? It means don't eat. They open the door while they're saying it. Or they go into the McDonald's and somebody's taught them how to order food. And they go up and they order a hamburger and fries and get to the table and they're taking their sister's chicken McNuggets. Because what do they really want? But nobody quite figured out there. You can imagine what will happen. Now they're on him because he's stealing his sister's food and bad boy and all of this. And the issue is somebody doesn't understand that he wants chicken McNuggets. Forget the burger. So what I often say is when parents, sometimes I get a little frustrated when they seem like they're really down on the child and they'll say, I just don't understand. Am I going to have to tell him this every day for the rest of his life? And I say, well, I don't understand why you don't understand that he doesn't understand. Okay? That's the problem. So, memory, they didn't have amnesia at all, but when the material became complex enough that you needed a cognitive support structure, or your brain needed to develop the gist, they couldn't do that. But there was nothing wrong with their basic memory. And then finally, of course, in reasoning, that split in the high-functioning people as well. They can do rule learning. If there's a rule in the test, they can do it. If there's no rule and they just have to figure out a rule to solve a problem, no. And so concept formations is something that they can't do. So do they have facts and information? And you think, gee, if they know all the bus schedules and or all the train schedules or everything else, then they can go out and ride the bus, right? Not. Or it's like the Rain Man was all preoccupied, remember, with the planes, but the accident statistics, and they ended up walking. So that part up in this page is where our adaptive function comes from, the capacity to take the information, the education, the whatever knowledge that you've acquired, and you go out in the world and you can solve whatever comes your way, for the most part. So what we had was this profile of what's intact or enhanced on the left side and what's impaired on the right side. And these, of course, are verbal individuals with IQ scores of 80 and higher with autism. Now, we had to figure out what the pattern meant, but many times when I'm asked a question about why won't this person do this or why is he doing that, and I listen to the people, we all automatically function on this side. We talk a lot, we're going to explain it so well that they're going to figure out the principle, right? Well, the person with autism, no matter what their IQ is, and no matter how many facts they can give you, they're over here. So my classic story for this is what I called the blue pill, pink pill. And it came about because we had a 28-year-old come into our hospital from Harrisburg. And he had a diagnosis of schizophrenia, only had that diagnosis since he was a little, which is your first hint, it's not schizophrenia, and there's no psychosis. But that's what happens to verbal people with autism. They're called schizophrenic, or something like that. And he had a job at Sears for 10 years, and we'd fall on our knees for somebody to have a job, let alone have it for 10 years. But eventually what happened is nobody knew he had autism, and nobody was his job coach, and nobody told the people he worked for. So he was big. There's the bigness problem. Very big person. And so he asked a new secretary one day something that she considered sexual. But to him, he was about a 2-3-year-old. So it was called sexual harassment. He was fired. And then he's staying at home. He had a roommate with schizophrenia. All by himself. I mean, no structure, nothing to do with his day. So he starts doing what his family of origin did a lot, which was TV evangelical shows. When they said send money, he did. And then he had no money for anything. And he was getting increasingly agitated because if you look in the Bible, it was, if in the shows, if you sin, you're going to hell. And to him, if you know autism, that's like Christmas is on December 25th. That's just a fact. So he's getting more and more agitated, carrying the Bible, and so he ends up being sent to us. And when they see somebody that has a diagnosis of schizophrenia, but they know he's not, then they call me. And they said that was in the days where you could be in the hospital for weeks. And they thought he was agitated and hyper-religious and thought, well, maybe he has mania as a part of this picture. But they wanted to start him on lithium, and he wouldn't do it. They'd say, we want to start you on lithium they're on the which side of the table. They had no sense of what he understood or what he didn't. It's a fooler when you have somebody that can talk that well and recite Bible verses and whatnot. And I said, well, does it come in 2 forms? Yes. What color? One was pink and one was blue. I said, you put it in one in each hand, and you go in there and you better know what he took before. And you tell him, you took the bad pink before, now you're going to take the good blue. He said, fine. They said, how did you know that worked? See, what we heard is that he'd been given lithium once before, and he got a stomach ache, and he came into the clinic, and the Mr. Yuck stickers, he thought he was going to die because he took a medicine. And the receptionist is going, you showed up without an appointment. What are you doing? He's an adult, You can't do that. You know that. The doctors are in session. And he thinks he's going to die, so he escalates, and pretty soon they've got the security, and he's on the floor. So he's never taking lithium again because he had that horrible experience. So many messages in that. The fellow that I'm talking about, the interesting thing is that you could go in and see him and ask him a question. He didn't answer you. The clinicians talked, then he talked. In other words, was there any reciprocity, which is supposed to be the cardinal feature of the social impairment in autism? None. And they didn't really recognize that, I think, because they're used to schizophrenics who can be off. But at any rate, what did that pattern mean? So we'll step back into our route. Well, the first thing is it wasn't easy to figure out because when do you have deficits in the same domain that you have intact or enhanced abilities? That was one we had to think about for a while. But there was the low-hanging fruit of the ability to acquire information was intact or even enhanced. And what it came down to is that the capacity for processing information was constrained. It's like the top half got cut off. Okay? So they had intact early simple information processing, but impaired higher order abilities across domains. So what it meant to us was that higher order brain circuitry was underdeveloped in autism, that cortical circuitry. And they were over-reliant on basic cognitive or visual abilities. Neuronal organization problem. We'll come back to that. I'm trying to make this easy, and there's no way to make it really easy. The question is, so that's where we started long ago. And where did we go with that? I want to give you an example that wherever we started may sound very simple to you right now, but it's evolved in very increasingly complex but important ways. So the question became, how altered is information processing in autism, and what is the neural basis of that? And what I try to tell people is that if a person with autism knows a detail, that's all they know. It's just that little bit of piece. Everybody always says, oh, if he knows that facts, then he knows all this other stuff. And he doesn't. They give new meaning to the word a single detail. And the distinction becomes, when do details, literally the details, become facts? And when does that become knowledge? And when does that become wisdom, or you can use it in real life? These are the dissociations that we get in autism that we have to understand. And we've come a long ways, but there's a lot yet. One of our imaging, probably second, third generation imaging studies came with this about language. We may tend to think that a word lives here or whatnot, but in actuality, when they had fMRI and applied a machine learning paradigm to analyze the MRI signal, that they could tell that the human brain in adults, typical adults, distributes the representation for all words, and according to 4 different features. And I was surprised that it's whether the word has anything to do with eating or shelter, or can you manipulate it, and for adults, it's the number of characters in the word. Not what you might have guessed. But actually, what this does is it allows you to use a word flexibly. If you have these characteristics and say they did tools and fruit, things like that. But for example, if you want to hang a picture and you don't have a hammer, you know what to do. If you're meeting with somebody with autism, and you've just bought a hammer, they might ask you, did you buy the red brand or the yellow brand? Which they know the name of and I don't. Because the one has only a 5-year warranty and the other one has a lifetime warranty. All I want to do is hang a picture, one picture, okay? But see the difference? And they can't, no hammer, no hanging the picture. For us, we take off our shoe and go quack, or something like that. But it's the reason that they're very narrow in their understanding of a word. We have somebody, for example, that's worked in a bank for years. But when we did a sentence about the alligator on the bank, he didn't know what the bank meant. He still thought bank meant the bank where you do your money. So they don't have that flexible understanding. And remember, the same problem comes up with problem solving. If they have a rule, they use the rule. And even if the rule isn't working and they can see it's not working, they still follow the rule. Remember the Rain Man movie? The light says walk, so he walks. And when it says don't walk, he's in the middle of the street and he stops. And what happens? The guy in the car starts honking. In other words, there's any cues from the outside, and then of course the guy yells at him, and then he gets out of the car, and he's still. It says don't walk. He's not walking. Now, of course, more able people, that's something that'll happen to a person with autism at that level of function, and more able people will have problems like with bank, or they can't figure out strategies. So the same problem with, if you might say, a narrow encoding of whether it's words or concepts or strategies is true rather globally. So this is what they're working on now, and the work's been done, data's been collected in autism children and adults, and they're writing it up at the moment. But the other place that we went is with comprehension was, if you looked across those domains, you'll see there was an awful lot of problems with concept formation. Whether you were dealing with memory, where their memory broke down when you needed a cognitive strategy, which is automatically generated by typical people, they didn't do that. Or if it was language, they didn't get the gist of the story, and they didn't get the metaphors or the idioms. Sort of higher levels of processing. And then certainly in the problem-solving domain, it was concept formation. So we started in a line of work. I found a infant cognitive person, which was a surprise to me because I did know that there's cognitive function in infants, but how much I didn't realize. So infant cognitive person, and he was already, Mark Strauss was already started a pilot study on face recognition in, say, 4 to 5-year-olds with a diagnosis of autism. And you're going to wonder, well, why do we look at faces? Because in order to recognize faces, you have to do what some people call configural processing. You have to integrate many different features or dimensions in order to distinguish one face from the other or even recognize a face. And the other part of this is this starts at about 6 months, okay? But it extends to all kinds of categories. Think about it. If you have an older infant, you get these board books, and they got the pictures of the animals. These are not, as Temple Grandin would say, photorealistic pictures. These are just some stylized sketch. You could have a blue cat, for that matter, you know, whatever's in the book. Not that many examples. But pretty soon that toddler or infant, you can point to the picture and, or say, pick the kitty. What's the kitty say? Which is the dog? And I was talking about this once, and a mother was in the audience from New York, and she said, they have a lot of money in New York, so they have a lot of weird dogs. And she says, you know, I've noticed these stroller babies go doggy, doggy, even if it's a really weird dog. They get the essence of dog. They don't get the detail. If you read Temple Grandin's books, she'll say to you that when she was young, maybe 6 or so, the only dog she knew was a German Shepherd. And then there was a cat. So big is dog, little is cat. Into the neighborhood comes a dachshund. She's done. Okay? And so she had to very deliberately set out all the pictures in her mind of dogs and all the pictures of cats and do a scientific study to figure out which features distinguished reliably between dogs and cats. Well, dogs have a nose pad, a nose rubber, that's fairly unique and different from cats. And of course they bark. Cats have retractable claws. That makes a cat, and then they meow, okay? But she tells this story and she says, but if I'd seen a bear, it wouldn't have worked because bears have the same nose rubber as dogs. Nobody, see, you don't even know how you got the category for all of the things around you, but what happens is that your brain does prototype formation automatically and so fast you don't even know it. So you may begin to think, boy, she says the word automatic processing a lot. And that's going to be one of the bottom lines. And I'm going to show you, here's a simple example of what a prototype it is. And I'm going to show you 3 pictures, and you kind of figure out which of the dogs is the essence, the best essence of doggy. And is it this one, or this one? Now, there's always bias in the audience, because if you happen to own dog number 3, that's the one you pick. But if you didn't own it, you're going, that is not the essence of dogginess. So it's really, in this particular grouping, it's The German Shepherd, he has the down tail, and the upright ears, okay, shorter snout. That's the doggy, This one's sort of typical, but a little bit off, except you own this dog, and you'll get upset with me for that, but a little bit different, Okay, so that's the idea. Without being taught the essence of dogginess, babies get it from these board books. And they make a few mistakes, but not very many. Do you really think you taught them, or do you think there might be a mechanism in the brain that gathers in all this data, creates a mean and standard deviations, and can tell dog and cat? So I'm going to show you that you do this. Your brain does this automatically. And I'm going to show you about 15 pictures like this, and at the end I'm going to say, which one is the most familiar picture of the two? Okay? So you're not going to memorize these faces, you're just going to look at them, okay? Everybody has to vote. Who votes for number 3 as the most familiar after looking at that? Don't be afraid, vote. Oh, this is number 3, one on the left. Sorry about that. I was a twig. Okay, how many votes for number 3? Okay, how many votes for number 4? It's the same. I've done this all over the country, all over the world. About 90% of the people pick this one. Why? Your brain calculated the exact arithmetic average of all the features and picked this one. Okay? This face, the number 4, the face on the right is actually a face that has features that you actually saw. So 2 different kinds of thinkers, but the majority of people see the same thing and pick the one that is the arithmetic average, or the mean. Your brain did that. How long did it take? Did it hurt? Did it take effort? Did you have to work? So a lot of our thinking occurs automatically, and this is not happening in autism. And it's going to be very important for us to understand this in our school education programs. They don't automatically know or learn or figure out the things that other people do. So we're going to need to develop educational tools that, if they have an element of the capacity, builds the capacity to develop prototypes. And that kind of work is already in progress. I lost some of my slides. They just checked out. But what the slides would show you is we spent about 5-7 years looking at face recognition, face emotion recognition, which requires that configural processing. It is a myth that everybody with autism has poor face recognition. There are people like Temple Grandin who can't tell one person from the other. She coded us, Jerry and I at the time, as short, blonde, rimless glasses, which meant Sally Rogers could also fit too, so let's not have the 3 of us. So that's all. And other people with autism code us with a single dimension. Oh, the woman in the office with that funny accent, she's also the tallest person and she has red hair. But when she got a cold, the person with autism couldn't recognize her because the voice was gone. She had a single dimension. No matter what it is, it was just one. But recognizing faces requires that you take multiple dimensions of information. How wide are the eyes and how is that close to the nose, and all of that very complex information, and integrates it. So what we saw with children and adults with autism between the ages of 5 and say 50 is that very early on, everybody had trouble with the unusual faces. You know, the woman that looks sort of on the more masculine side. But over time, by 8 to 12 years of age, typical children have mastered face recognition. There's some additional benefit until adults. The children, the high-functioning children and adults with autism really maxed out at the 8 to 12-year-old level. As long as it's really typical, they can tell. But if it's somebody like me with short hair or a woman with kind of heavy brows, they still have trouble. And you're thinking, well, why do we care about that? We care about that because it means that their brain isn't doing this prototype development. And how do you recognize face expression? It's the same way. How do you figure out how to solve a problem? It's the same sort of mechanics in the brain. That's why it's important. It's something that we can test. So we'll skip that. Now we're going to shift from, we saw that profile of deficits. You saw how far you can go in looking into it and how relevant the most recent developments are to intervention. But let's go back to the brain for a little bit. This is a very early fMRI scan, and the task that elicited the activation, which is in the red, is what we call a spatial working memory. So it typically elicits activation like this. This is the frontal area, dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which is our executor. And then we get down to sort of the visual spatial activation, mostly a left hemisphere task in a neurotypical group, a little bit of right hemisphere. Here's the autism group, and this really predicted what we were going to see with fMRI tasks for the next 10 years. The first thing is no DLPFC, no frontal cortex circuitry activation there. Even though they could do the task, they weren't doing it the same way, which means they're going to top out early. And the second thing that I think is stands out is that we ended up with bilateral visual spatial activation. They were relying on visual area to do this. For some tasks, that might be helpful. You know, if they have to go through hieroglyphics and figure out which one's different, call the person with autism, they will do that. Or read all the labels, the address labels, they'll find the zip codes that are off. Things like that, the details, because many of them are very visual, not all of them. And then something that we found later is they had to kind of work harder at this. This is the more elementary eye movement areas here, which you see showing up. And it's interesting, even that persisted in later studies. So very simply, here began the connectivity story in autism, which is pretty well established, very well established now, that in the brain, the development of connectivity is altered. Underdevelopment of cortical systems and perhaps enhanced local. But it started really with Marcel Just in Pittsburgh at Carnegie Mellon, who began to look past just the activation, the Christmas tree analysis, and said, what's the correlations between these regions? And regions working together had some yellow or white if they were working in a synchronous manner. Pink was they're so not working together. And here's just one person with autism and one control as an example. And down in the control, there's a lot of anterior-posterior connectivity. These regions in the back are working with the regions in the front, right? Not so much in autism, right? And over time, the evidence became very consistent. It was underdevelopment of connectivity with frontal cortex, whether it's cortical or it's amygdala, limbic, striate, underdevelopment with frontal cortex. That's our highest level integrator, okay, and the last to mature. So here's just two examples of fMRI functional connectivity data from the very early days. And what we saw across all the tasks was this same thing, greater level of functional connectivity in the controls, but the autism group was a parallel curve. We're not dealing with a totally different brain, which was very encouraging with this. And here's another example, bihemispheric task. And so very soon, people began to think, well, gee, how do we move this lower curve up to the higher curve? Or what's keeping it from being up there? And its pattern extended. This is Stuart Mostovsky's work from Hopkins. He got interested in the motor area in autism and doing skilled motor tasks. He could show it was the same underconnectivity with frontal cortex. And implicit in what I showed you with the profile is that every one of those domains that is affected, whether it's memory, motor, or sensory, have the same pattern of impact. Elementary skills intact, higher order skills not. So in other words, the motor and sensory problems are as much a bona fide part of autism as the so-called core symptoms. Okay, so core is sort of a misnomer. They may be the symptoms that impact kids the most because they demand the most complex information processing, but they're not the only area. So Stuart's come back, and, as have others, and showed that same thing in the motor area, another validation of that. Let me skip this. I think the next thing that's been very important in changing our understanding of autism has been the studies of infants. Infants at risk for autism by virtue of having one or more older children with autism. When this work started, they thought the recurrence risk in a family, if you have one child, what's the chance of a second? They thought it was around 6 to 7%, and sometimes people would even say 4%. And 10 years or so later, it's really 20%. If you have one child, 20% recurrence. If you have two or more children, you're getting up to 35, 39% chance that your next child will have autism. Many more. So what was happening? We were missing these kids. Why did our prevalence rate double? Well, goodness, we went from 6% to 20% if you have one child. Where did that other 14% go? Well, they were out there, just like that adult in Harrisburg who comes in. They always were out there. They were called something else. And it didn't work very well. So they started these studies because they wanted to know what was causing autism. And of course, the people that had the social deficit hypothesis said, if we see these children when autism is first manifesting, it's going to be a social impairment that jumps out at you first, right? But what would the neurologist say? For example, what would Max say? He'd say, no, that's not how it's going to play out, right? So sure enough, this is the sort of initial findings. There are some earlier, but for the most part, at 6 months of age, these babies are normal, or they're very socially engaged. And there's not anything obviously wrong. There's little postural control problems that we picked up and a few things like that. But the big point is it validated what many parents said, I didn't think there was anything wrong with my baby until they got older, that it was there. And we'd always just think, maybe you kind of didn't notice. Okay, but it's true. At 6 months, they can look very socially engaged. And it's not till around 9 months and later that manifestations start to emerge. And what are they? Some funny sort of repetitive motor, subtle, but there. Some exaggerated responses to sensory. And another one that may be the first thing that people notice is unusual visual regard. In other words, what they're looking at. And the ceiling fans is the common one. I had a colleague whose 3 out of 4 grandchildren have ASD. And the first thing that he noticed was that the first child was like the ceiling fans. He said, that's the first thing I noticed. So, not the early language problems, not until 12 months do you get standardized test evidence of language delay. But they also noticed things like temperament may have been normal at 6 months, but it was increasingly fussy, irritable, tough to console. That's not part of the core symptoms. And then what they saw from 12 months on was the more, I don't want to say more typical, everything's typical, it's part of it, is they then began to see the substantial lags in language development, communication, so-called social joint attention. But also, they saw these kids as developing that irritability, the problems regulating both emotion and motion, that overactivity. That's supposed to be the comorbid ADHD, but it's not. It's really the autism and the mood lability. That's not the bipolar. It's just the persistence of more of an infant, very young child's reaction. Things are going well, they're happy. If they're not, they're really upset. Only that can go on into adulthood, where you get the equivalent of being yelled at and told off, and it's really, I don't want you to be my mommy anymore, go. I hate you. And then you see them the next day and they're just like they were before, you're fine. And you just have to realize you have an infant in there. So what they saw is that, I want to emphasize the last point here, is that the associated symptoms are an integral part of the syndrome. They didn't emerge after, they emerged with all the other symptoms that we accept as being part of autism. And that includes poor gross motor development. And so finally, this is 2009, Sally Rogers says, these findings do not support the view that autism is primarily a social communication disorder, and instead suggests that autism disrupts multiple aspects of development simultaneously. The other thing I want to point out is they documented that between 12 and 24 months, there's the subgroup that dramatically loses skills. And so what do we call them later? Mental retardation or intellectual disability. So that was clearly part and parcel of the autism, not a comorbid disorder. But the idea from this is, what if we can intervene at 12 months or 14 months? Before we've completely gone down the chute? Can we stop that? Because remember, I started by saying thinking can change the brain. So Sally likes to say that the first cognitive intervention is a behavioral intervention. So their Early Start Denver model deals with very young children. What it's added is the affective component, which all the recent interventions have. Here's the genes. We'll skip that because your developmental neurobiologists have that covered. And go to some more evidence about how, whatever you want to call these interventions, do you call a reading intervention a behavioral intervention, or do you call it a cognitive, or maybe you call it a reading intervention. But Marcel Just, who does the imaging, was involved in analyzing the images from children who were poor readers who received 12 weeks of intervention. And he could show that with current techniques that there was a change in myelination and in the brain with that intervention. So we had the advantage that he'd done that. And so we have a bunch of studies. I just want to show you one that is based off that profile. And it's really, I'm going to have to skip these. Very interesting. See, this is your developmental neurobiologist doing that work. Here we go. Here's the intervention that one of the interventions we're focusing on for adults. It was originally developed for schizophrenia over several decades by a social worker in our Department of Psychiatry. And it's a neurocognitive intervention, and rather like the neurocognitive or neurorehab interventions they've used in dementia or multiple sclerosis or brain injury, traumatic brain injury. So it used those very typical intervention programs, cognitive-based, remediation of basic, memory, attention, whatnot. But he added a component that's sort of the social cognition. And this whole intervention is 18 months. The social cognitive is about 9 months. And the various components of it basically help adults with autism, to understand the cultural wisdom that the rest of us automatically have that they don't. Why don't you tell everybody that you know everything about yourself? So they have a construct of front stage, backstage. You know, there's some things that you can put on the front stage, but other things. So they have worked to evolve this over 30 years, and so it really works really well. But the other thing it does is it teaches them a working knowledge of perspective taking. What are other people thinking in response to what you say? And one simple example of how they do this is that they have the group exercise, everybody gets some assignments, and if it's your turn, you may come in the first time, and your job to introduce yourself. So that's your job. But everybody else in the group is supposed to write down, pay attention, what did you like about what they said, or how they said it, what's something they did well, and what's something they could do that would make it better. And a lot of exercises like that, and by the end, guess what? When they're the ones standing up there, they're thinking about all those comments. Oh, I have to look at the whole group. I have to have some eye contact. I have to use some facial expression. I have to not give too many details. I have to give details that people will be interested in. And there's a group like that called Toastmasters. And I actually have a young man in Indiana who's gone to Toastmasters and has become an effective communicator. It's the same thing. Okay, so I say that because out there in their community, you already have some things that could be brought to bear on this. So this one, let me go rather quickly. It's 18 months. We changed it so that it enhanced some parts for autism that aren't true in schizophrenia. 2-part, computer-based training in attention, memory, and problem solving, and then the social cognitive groups. And the data in autism is done but not reported, and the person who leads this intervention, Dr. Eek, it's his right to present it. I can only say to you, here's what's in schizophrenia, and the people with autism are responding better than the people with schizophrenia. So we compared cognitive enhancement therapy with enhanced supportive treatment, okay? Quite different programs, but matched number of hours of intervention. And arrow, oops, no arrow, where'd you go? There it is. So here's the CET group, and here's where they started. Here's an overall neurocognition component: processing speed, cognitive style, social cognition, blah, blah, blah. Each of these domains that they work on. And you can see that with the autism people, they made a certain amount of improvement at 1 year, okay? And then they made this amount of improvement in 2 years. This is effect size. So look at how much improvement they got out of these neurocognitive skill training. Now, I knew it worked in schizophrenia, but look at processing speed. If we had to make a general statement about what's wrong in cognition, is they're slow thinkers. Some of them are so slow. And I've learned I only say a little bit, and then I have to wait, because I know they've got to process that. And when they've done it, they usually look up. I can tell. And then I say the next thing. So it's almost like the old days where the computer would go ka-clink, ka-clink. You can see them thinking it's so slow. And don't ask them to do 2 things at once. We designed an fMRI task. It took forever to find 2 things that they could actually do at the same time. So multitasking, multi-streams of information aren't good. But processing speed, we hoped, but look at that, beyond our dreams. And this is schizophrenia and autism. It's better. So all of these areas are better. And the 2-year evaluation means that they've been out of this intervention for at least a year, and it's maintained, if not continued to have some improvement. Now, the next part, amazingly, they didn't get funding back then to do the imaging studies in schizophrenia. They've had some, and they're just starting a complete study now. So autism is ahead of them, in a sense. So they actually saw that over time, these are the bottom, This is what happens in enhanced supportive therapy. Over time, the amygdala, the fusiform gyrus, or the face area, and their hippocampus and parahippocampal, those brain areas are declining in volume in people with schizophrenia, in basically community care, good community care. But those who underwent CET, look at that. Their brain volume is not only not going down, amygdala, big time for emotions, fusiform, okay? So do your cognitive interventions have an impact on the brain? And the answer is yes, they do. So it's really find the mechanism. The active ingredients appear to be increasing processing speed, which helps all of the domains, okay, and perspective taking. Those seem to be the two active ingredients. This is not going to be the be-all, end-all, but it's the first intervention in autism that targets core deficits. And that's what we don't have, but what we do need. And then there's many others that will come along to do this. So my sense is that the more able people with autism will respond to these neurocognitive interventions, and we'll get much, much better, and we'll have a whole stable of them. And we'll have maintenance. We already have maintenance, community maintenance that can be used in schools. And that's the next one that'll enter a pilot. And I'm sure I'm way over time, but what I would say about this is that a psychologist that I worked with for about 20 years in the community, he get all the tough cases, not that, or the tough, and verbal. And he realized that you had to use non-traditional psychotherapy, very non-traditional. But he also realized that the kinds of trouble that they got into in life, there were patterns to this, and there were some key issues, and they weren't getting it, because you could say, well, that's just like the thing that happened last week, when, oh, no, it's not. That was Thursday, or that was, whatever. That was Sam. Today it was Sally, and it's Friday. It's just whatever it was. They couldn't see any similarity between the behavior problems that were occurring. And if you don't see any similarity, you can't develop a strategy or use a strategy. So he developed what he calls icons, and they're copyrighted, but they're about 10 pictures, and it's very important that it's visual because they need to see it to get it. And so the simplest one is a teeter-totter, and the idea with this, if you are handed this card, it means it's your turn. You're talking, and it means other people don't. So this is a family intervention. Because a person that doesn't socialize or doesn't communicate much, as soon as they do, what happens? Everybody around them is going, blah, 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 blah. And then they're like, I'm out of here. I'm not. No more. So one of my rules, by the way, is that nobody can talk more than the person with autism, and they can't start talking to them. The person with autism has to start, and then you have to gauge very carefully. If you do that, you can take somebody that's only getting up at night because that's when there's nobody around, to a person that gets up during the days, shovels the neighbor's sidewalk when it snows, and volunteers at the local school, and goes and gets their own prescriptions and joins. It took a year, a little at a time, following that single principle. But at any rate, the other icons, one of my favorites is there's a picture frame, a big picture frame, and then a little picture frame. And what that means is they get obsessed on some detail, and they're missing the big point. So what he's able to do as he works with them after developing a relationship where it's really not so much trust, is you have to be smart enough for a person with autism or they don't respect you. And so, and you have to be willing to share personal information because they want to know you, things you never do in traditional psychiatry. But they would learn, as he would say, well, this problem sounds like this, and we show the picture. And over time, they actually do begin to recognize that this situation is really like this situation and it involves this problem, and they're one of 10. And then they can begin to do much better in real life. So that's one that teachers can use. And of course, anything we do in schools or any other setting that's good for people with autism is helpful for everybody else there. So that's my hope, is that these things will propagate through the schools and the teachers will use them no matter who's having problems with a blow up or a meltdown, not just with the person with autism. And yes, I'm stopping now. Thank you.
Do we have time for a few questions?
It's fine with me.
Anybody? Okay, go ahead.
You talked about how people with autism will see these many examples of stimuli and fail to form a prototype.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess I think sometimes we form a prototype when there isn't a connection.
Right,
So,
exactly.
Of course, I want to push on whether there really is a condition known as autism. That is, should we really be thinking? And later on in the talk, you came on to talk about how there's a very broad range of effects of this disorder. And of course, that conclusion is predicated on the idea that it's a single disorder, and I guess some genetic evidence suggests that there may not be a single disorder, but a number coming together.
Okay, and if you ask anything more, I won't remember. I think I'd start with the last thing. It depends on whether you're a lumper or a splitter in medicine as to whether you say autisms, which I don't like. I mean, we have a common syndrome and a common pathophysiology. At the same time, there's a lot of heterogeneity that we have yet to account for. And certainly having many different genes, of which there's not going to be one or two. It could potentially be 100 genes in each person and having different, mostly small effects. So if you want to call that, each of those different, but to me, I think of it, they have the same syndrome, and it's the same problems in life that they're having. You know, when they come in, we don't know whether they have a neuroligin or a neuralexin or a shank or any of these genes, you know, so I think that'll fade. It's still going to be a syndrome for which different causes will be identified, but when it comes to recognition by the pediatrician or the psychiatrist, okay, so that's what I'd say about that. And the one before that is, you know, people who are mildly affected by autism and who, because of their autism, go on and be very successful. No, they don't want to be different. It's like Temple Grandin. Would you ever in your life want her to be different? She didn't want to be different. She wouldn't want to be. If we could get rid of her autism right now, she wouldn't do it because she likes the way she thinks. And she's such a remarkable human being. How many people do you know are world famous in 3 areas and have been celebrated for their contributions? Cattle industry for her. If you eat meat, there's a 50% chance it went through a plant that she designed. Secondly, she's made enormous impact on humane treatment of animals. Now, the purchasers of beef, if the plant doesn't follow Temple Grandin's 5-point checklist, if they don't pass it, they're not buying meat from them. And so that's made an enormous difference in, we don't even, as Temple says, I can't even tell Mother what they did to those chickens, you know. You don't even want to know. And that's made an impact worldwide. And then she's been acknowledged as humane treatment of animals, just a star. How many people do you know who are stars in 3 areas? Or 1 area, let's pick one, internationally. Okay, Temple's delightful. I mean, so there's a lot of people with autism that we don't discover until we see their child who's more severely impacted. And so no, you're right. Do we need to change that? No. As Temple Grandin said about a couple weeks ago at our place, if you got rid of all the Aspies, say goodbye to your iPhone and your every other technology, because when it wears out, there's not going to be anybody to fix it. As she says, the world runs on these techies, and a lot of them kind of the Asperger's. So no, we don't want to change that. But there was an article that I saved from years ago from a mother who had 2 children with autism, and she said, let me tell you about a crapisode. Because people who didn't want autism, don't find a cause for it because we're not interested in the treatment, and you're bad people for thinking. But this mother said, let me tell you about a crapisode. I have 2 moderate to severely affected children with autism. And in the morning, they've got to catch a bus. And one of them is just learning about going potty in the potty. And it's a celebration. So she doesn't flush the toilet. The other one has no clue about that, but plays with the poop and smears it all over. And to her, a crapisode is the day when the one child went in the potty and the other child went and smeared it all over, and the bus is out front and honking. And she said, I'm sorry, but I want something better for my children than that. And so it's easy to think, well, gee, if you're Temple Grandin, no, you don't need a cure. But Temple's out there beating the bush every millions and millions of miles she flies. Why? Because there's lots of people with autism who are much more severely impaired, and it produces a lot of, sadness and pain in the child and in the families. Yes?
Actually, your point is so well made, Dr. Minshew. Thank you very much. As a parent of a child with autism, that is the reason that I've never fallen in love with Welcome to Holland. Mm-hmm.
Yes, I do.
Because
They may not, but I do.
because Holland is not just different from Italy.
Right.
Depending on where you sit on the spectrum, Holland can be crap.
Can be. You can get robbed, which I did in Holland.
Right.
But you're right. It's not just that you have a different world. People with autism see the world differently, and it's very logical. And if you learn how they see the world, you can communicate effectively to those who can communicate. But it's, if you even talk to Temple, she'll tell you high school was hell. It was horrible. And so many, I don't know any children with autism unless they're the occasional one that's really big and quiet, that don't get mercilessly teased in horrible ways. If they're big and they're quiet, people are afraid. But if they figure out that they can push them around, then they're done. But one of the worst was the mother who opened her door one day and some person had put a note, I wish your child was dead. This is a high-functioning kid with autism, and he may have been strange, but he wasn't doing anything except being different or strange. So that's not exactly pain-free, But we also have a bigger problem with teasing of all kids that are different. Yes?
One more question? Thank you.